Hikaru Nakamura knows how to make his opponent's life difficult in a King's Indian defense. He's a master of both sides of the opening, and in this game, Hikaru has white against Alexander Grischuk, another Super Grand Master. Let's jump right in. This is from the FIDE Grand Prix in Berlin in 2022, and Hikaru has the white pieces, Grischuk has black. D4, knight f6, c4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6, bishop e2, castles. We see the standard classical King's Indian formation from white. But here, Nakamura throws his opponent a curveball. He plays the move bishop to e3. The main moves here are knight to f3, the classical King's Indian. And also you see this move, bishop g5, the Averbach King's Indian, designed to prevent black from playing e5. But what Nakamura plays is bishop to e3. And this is what's called a semi-Averbach, and it leaves white with a very flexible pawn formation. He could play knight f3 and play a Gligorich system or anything at this point. Black doesn't really know what white wants to play, so Grischuk plays e5, a standard move. Knight f3 would transpose to a Gligorich system. D5, though, was played by Hikaru, and then knight to a6. He wants to pop that knight into c5 as quickly as he can, and he's aided by the fact that this knight is still on g1. If this knight had been on f3, he could immediately respond with knight to d2, over defending e4, and then b4, kicking the knight out. Since he can't do that, Grischuk wants to get into c5 as quickly as possible. After h4, knight to c5 was played. Grischuk had actually had this position earlier against Aronian, and he played h5. That game ended up being a draw. The only problem with h5 is he can't, or it's harder to play f5 later because it weakens that g5 square. So here he just plays knight to c5, immediately threatening to capture on e4. Queen c2 to defend that pawn, and now c6. Grischuk is playing for queenside counterplay. He wants to take on d5, maybe play b5, queen to a5, and so forth. And here, Nakamura plays h5. Well, can't he just play b4 here and knock this knight out of the way? I mean, this pawn is defended twice, right? Well, it doesn't work because of this nice tactical response. Knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, knight takes knight, queen takes knight, and now bishop to f5 would have been played. The queen is forced to go to the f3 square and then e4. The pawn attacks the queen, the bishop attacks the undefended rook, and black would win in that case. So he can't play b4 here. So after c6, he plays h5. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, queen to a5, pinning the c3 knight and threatening to capture on e4. If he plays f3 to defend that pawn, then just knight takes h5 would be fine for black. So he plays h6 immediately. Now, moves like this used to be frowned upon because it closes down this file for the rook. But these Alpha Zero type computers have shown that this idea can be extremely strong. That pawn is a real irritant for black and makes it hard to develop his pieces. Bishop to h8, which is forced. Now f3 is played, defending that pawn. And bishop to d7. Gawain Jones, the British Grandmaster, and also a King's Indian player, recommends the move knight to h5 here, trying to take advantage of some of these weakened dark squares. Grischuk plays bishop to d7 to support the b5 pawn push. Rook to b1, threatening b4 and forking the knight and the queen. So knight to a4 gets out of the fork, adds some pressure to the knight on c3, queen to d2. So Hikaru is threatening to play knight to b5, so these queens would be traded. And if the queens were traded, white would just be probably just winning. I mean, this is a terrible endgame for white. He's got, or for black, excuse me. He's got no counterplay. White has all of this space. The bishop is stuck on h8. Black cannot allow queens to be exchanged. So knight takes c3. He has to take with the pawns because he has to defend the a2 pawn with the queen. So now queen to c7. White's threatening to take on b7. Queen c7 defends. g4, the novelty of the game, believe it or not, gaining space on the king's side. Bishop to c8, clearing the d7 square. So Grischuk can play knight d7, knight c5. This c5 square is the soft spot in the position. Knight to h3. He wants to play the knight to f2. And these positions with these pawn structures with f3, e4, d5, and the King's Indian, sort of a Zamish type structure, this knight often wants to land on f2. It's just a square where it covers a lot of vulnerabilities in white's position. It's a well-placed piece. That knight goes to h3 and f2. That's a good place to put it. Knight to d7, knight to f2, bishop to f6, trying to get that bishop outside of its prison on h8. Castles, bishop e7, king to h2. Bishop, by the way, to e7 clears the f-pawn so it can advance. King to h2, knight to c5, and now knight to d3, challenging that knight on c5. b6 adds another defender to it. Knight takes, bc5. Now here Nakamura makes an interesting decision. It's a move that in certain positions is just a bad move, but here it is strong. He plays f4, opening up lines for white on the king side. Pawn takes, bishop takes f4, and if black had a knight that could hop into this square, or if this bishop were already on the long diagonal, that would be different. But now the open lines favor white. Bishop to d7. If he plays bishop to f6, white can play the idea of queen to e3, queen to g3, and attack the d6 pawn, and black wouldn't want to exchange bishops on e5. That would give white a protected passer. So he plays bishop to d7, c4, clearing the way for the queen to go to c3 and threaten mate on g7. Grischuk plays rook a to b8, probably going ahead and playing bishop to f6 here was the best move, simply to keep the queen from establishing herself on this diagonal, which she does immediately. Queen to c3, f6, rook to b3, also the immediate g5, trying to pry open that long diagonal was a good move. Rook to b3, rook to b6, now g5, rook to f7, the rook covers the g7 square, and bishop to c1, a brilliant rearranging of the minor pieces from Hikaru. He wants to place this bishop on b2 so the queen and bishop work as a battery, attacking down this long diagonal. The queen goes to d8, adding another defender to f6. The bishop does go to b2. Now queen to f8, adding to the defense of this pawn. King to g2, in the future sort of keeping black from maybe penetrating on the f2 square. Black can't take on g5 yet because queen h8 mate, but later. Bishop to d8, giving the queen room to maybe play queen e7, queen e5, and harass the black king a little bit. Queen to f3, I have to say I'm not 100% certain what the idea was behind this move. Maybe he's trying to bait Grischuk into taking the g5 pawn, like at fg5, and then coming back to c3 with mate threats. That's a possible idea behind that move. But after bishop c8, he plays back queen to e3. Rook takes b3, a b3. Pawn takes, and now queen to c3, threatening mate on h8. Rook takes f1. This gives the king a flight square. Queen to h8 check. King to f7. Queen h7 check. King to e8. Queen to g6 check. So black is up a rook, but the pressure on his position is simply too great. It would make sense to block the check with the rook that's at f8, or f1, excuse me, rook to f7. However, that loses to bishop to h5. When the king moves out of the pin, just take, and h7, and the pawn could not be stopped. The pawn would be turning into a queen, so he can't do that. King to e7, queen takes g5, check. White has collected a lot of material and is in good shape here. Rook to f6, and this move ends things more quickly. The way to make it harder for white would have just been to play king to d7, bishop g4 check, king c7, then queen to g7, king to b8. This is the best black can do, but white is still winning. But after rook to f6, now h7, threatening to queen the pawn. The king goes to d7, and then after this brilliant move from Nakamura, queen to g8, Alexander Grischuk resigned. The pawn, he can do nothing about the pawn. If he, say, plays rook to f2 check, then just king to g1. That's it. And if he plays queen to h6 to try to complicate matters, queen, then rook to g6 check, bishop to g4 check, interfering with the rook's check, and after rook g4, queen takes g4 check would win. And if the king moves to c7, just queen takes, and a quick mate would follow. So a really brilliant game from Nakamura, and as a King's Indian player myself, I don't know if I like seeing it torn up so easily as it was in this game, but Nakamura still plays it from time to time, so we can still trust in the opening. It wasn't the opening, it was the players. Thank you for joining us at Chess Dog. See you again soon.